Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 224, Fortuna Villa. Christopher Ballerstedt and his son Theodore Ballerstedt started building a house known as Fortuna Villa in the mid-1850s in Bendigo. It initially commenced as a modest single-storey home in 1861. It was located atop of the rich New Chum gold reef. Fortuna Villa is an outstanding demonstration of the wealth and prosperity of Bendigo and Victoria during the gold rush period. The quartz crushing works that were on the site represented a direct link between the owner's wealth and the source of their wealth. Although there were no mines on the Fortuna site, the estate was largely developed on the waste from Lansell's 180 mine, which was north of Fortuna, and it was one of the richest mines in Bendigo. The ore treatment site was gradually transformed into a picturesque landscape of lakes and gardens. Fortuna Villa also demonstrates the lavish lifestyle of very wealthy families of Victoria's gold rush period. The property was sold from the Ballerstedt family to George Lansell, and he made marked improvements to the home. It can definitely be said that gold built Fortuna Villa. This villa still exists today. So a little firstly on Theodore Ballerstedt. Theodore's father was Johann Gottfried Tobias Christoph Ballerstedt, known as Christopher, and he was born on the 7th of August 1796 in Germany. Christopher was drafted in the Prussian army and fought at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 when Napoleon was finally defeated. Christopher married Dorothea Louise Emily Arnsten in Magdeburg, Germany on the 23rd of May 1824. Christopher was 27 and Dorothea 17. His son Theodore travelled to the Californian goldfields in the late 1840s but had little luck there. Theodore had heard of discoveries of gold in Australia, and he and Christopher travelled to Sydney in 1852 and made their way overland to various goldfields, eventually arriving at Sandhurst, which is today's Bendigo, with their belongings in a wheelbarrow. Christopher was known to Bendigo locals as being quite eccentric. Christopher and Theodore bought a claim at Victoria Hill, which was to the northwest of Sandhurst town above New Chum Gully, and they bought it from a disappointed African-American, Dido Weymouth, for £60 in 1854. This was the first reef worked in the Bendigo area and one of two principal lines of reef on the Bendigo goldfields. Christopher began working an open cut systematically in 1855 on the Victoria Reef. Most of the gold was found by washing alluvial gravels at the surface. After working the reef in that open cut mine, he sank a shaft of 90 metres and struck a rich reef of gold. He celebrated his luck with a champagne luncheon attended by Sir Henry Berkeley, the Governor of Victoria. Christopher Ballerstedt had several successful claims on Victoria Hill, and in the 1860s he was probably the richest man in Bendigo, if not the whole of Victoria. He was known as the father of quartz reefing in Bendigo, and his success encouraged others to explore Bendigo's deep reefs. One miner wrote of the excitement in Bendigo as the claims on Victoria Hill tapped new and richer reefs. Victoria Hill is passing belief and inviting incredulity. It is like an eastern tale that within so small an area there should have extracted a plethora of wealth beyond the dreams of avarice. By 1861, 1,200,000 ounces of gold had been extracted from the site. Christopher was nicknamed the father of the hill and was the first to prove that gold reefs extended below the surface. The Ballerstedts were well known and respected citizens of Bendigo. When the Duke of Edinburgh arrived in Bendigo on the 18th of December 1867, a written address was presented to him on behalf of the miners of the district, signed by Theodore Ballerstedt and two others. Theodore Ballerstedt was an architect, and he signed the 1853 Bendigo Goldfields Petition. The Anti-Gold Licence Association was formed at Bendigo in June 1853. This association focused its attention on the 30-shilling monthly licence fee that miners were required to pay to the government. They drew up a petition outlining their grievances and called for a reduced licence fee, improved law and order, the right to vote and the right to buy land. The petition was signed by diggers through Bendigo, Ballarat, Castlemaine, Mackayver, which is nowadays Heathcote, and Mount Alexander, which is today known as Harcourt. The 13-metre long petition was presented to Lieutenant Governor Charles Latrobe in Melbourne on the 1st of August 1853, but their call for a reduction in monthly licence fees and land reform for diggers was rejected. The diggers' dissatisfaction erupted into the Red Ribbon Rebellion, where agitators wore red ribbons on their hat, symbolising their defiance of the law and the prohibitive licence fees. Christopher Ballerstedt died on the 17th of October 1869 at the age of 74. His death notice was placed in the Bendigo Advertiser. At his residence, New Chum Gully, Sandhurst, Christopher Ballerstedt Esquire, in his 74th year, the much beloved and revered father of Theodore Ballerstedt Esquire, JP. Theodore continued the mining interests of Ballerstedt and Son until the 6th of May 1871, when he sold his residence at New Chum, his machinery and his many valuable claims to George Lansell for the sum of £30,000. After selling off his interests in Sandhurst, Theodore Ballerstedt returned with his family to Germany. And a mention in the local paper of his farewell. At Bendigo's Shamrock Hotel, the family were farewelled by his mining friends. Richard Andrews said, "Your name will always be identified with the great mining interests of Bendigo, to the development of which your late lamented father, whose memory will forever be dear to all who knew him, so eminently contributed by the energy and perseverance which he, with yourself, devoted to the opening up of the now worldwide known and celebrated Victoria Reef." Theodore was presented with a valuable diamond ring, and a souvenir ring was also presented to Mrs. Ballerstedt. Dorothea died at Magdeburg, Germany on the 4th of February 1875 at the age of 69, and Theodore died at Magdeburg in 1876. And now to George Lansell. George Lansell was born in Margate, England on the 24th of August 1823. He was the eldest son of Thomas Lansell, a grocer, and a tallow chandler, and Elizabeth Budds. At the age of 14, George left school to assist his father in the family business. When Lansell received letters from his brother Wooten, a ship's officer who travelled widely and visited Australia several times, he decided to emigrate and try his luck at the goldfields of Australia. With his two brothers, he emigrated to Echunga in South Australia to pan for gold. By late in 1853, George and his brothers Wooten and William had moved to Bendigo to set up their business as butchers and soap and candle manufacturers. By 1855, stockbrokers were visiting George and were encouraging him to invest in deep shaft mining. By 1860, he had invested and lost and then reinvested a number of times. He was learning what was required to be successful at this type of mining. 1865 was a bad year of mining for Bendigo. Lansell took advantage of the tough times and he bought up many shares in the Advance Mining Company and the Cinderella Mine. He insisted that miners go deeper than ever before, and from then on he and his companies reaped massive rewards. As he continued to prosper, so did he continue to invest his money in new mining companies. So consistent and confident was he that he became known as the Quartz King of Bendigo and was most sought after an advisor in mining matters. He was the promoter of the Garden Gully United Mine, the most famous of all Bendigo mines, in which, in spite of its varying fortunes and long-delayed success, George Lansell always had the greatest faith. He was ready to back his opinion and stand by it, with the result that he became the sole owner of several mines. Most of these claims were originally held by companies in which Lansell had large investments. He continually increased these interests, buying out the faint-hearted shareholders. He then sank shafts deeper and deeper, venturing large sums of money, but maintaining his firm faith in the properties, eventually reaping rewards. By the 1870s, he'd accumulated a large fortune from the Garden Gully mine, and he then purchased the 180 mine. Although he initially always was on the edge of financial ruin in what appears to be a typical example of his luck, one of the claims purchased by him from Ballerstedt turned out to be his most famous acquisition, the Big 180. The reef had been reached to 180 feet, hence the name. Lansell didn't hesitate to adopt his custom, and he sank deeper and deeper. From the first stope he worked in the 180 mine, he yielded a clear profit of £180,000. In another speculative move, he subdivided land he'd purchased around the former government house in Toorak Road, Melbourne. He named the subdivision Vice Regal Estate, and the streets Lansell Road and St George's Road. When he purchased Fortuna Villa in 1871, Lansell already owned the adjacent Fortuna mine, and he continually added to and expanded the villa, decorating it extravagantly with the finest of artworks and materials, and made it into a sprawling mansion with extensive landscape grounds, creating a house and grounds the size and grandeur that had few rivals in Australia. In 1872, George Lansell, at the age of 49, married Bedelia Mary Jarvis née Mulgorney, who was 30, an Irish woman who'd immigrated with her family to South Australia in 1850. Bedelia had first married at the age of 14 to Thomas Jarvis in Adelaide. Thomas Jarvis died in 1870. Bedelia had trouble adjusting to her newly acquired social status as the wife of the Court's King, and Bedelia died at aged only 38 in September 1880 in Melbourne. They had no children. On the 4th of February 1881 in the Ballarat Courier, reference was made in the Equity Court today in the will of Mrs. Bedelia Lansell, wife of George Lansell. This lady, who died in September last year, bequeathed her own personal property valued at £5,431 to her sister and her sister's children. Mrs. Windows lodged a caveat against the granting of the probate. Mrs. Windows had to show cause why probate should not be granted to Mr. Carter, the executor. Mr. Lansell consented to the application, and Justice Molesworth granted the rule nisi as asked. George Lansell quickly became one of Australia's wealthiest men, and possibly its first gold mining millionaire. He was a man of great repute, not just in Bendigo, but throughout Australia and Great Britain. In 1876, George returned to England for the first time. He toured the continent and visited the excavations at Pompeii. Finding a coffin in his stable yard one morning and taking this as a sign that his success had brought him enemies, he again returned to England in 1880. He married Harriet Edith Basford on the 12th of August 1883 in London. Harriet had been born in Staffordshire, and she was 26 when she married George, who was 59. In 1887, in a response to a letter that was signed by over 2,500 Bendigo citizens begging him to return, he did. He immersed himself in business, and he left for the United States, where he visited Nevada and California, inspecting mining methods there. He was very impressed with what he saw, especially the recently introduced diamond rock drill, which he subsequently used very successfully in some of his mines after returning home. George continued to build onto Fortuna Villa. He collected furniture, sculptures and art from around the globe. His wealth and renown are demonstrated in the calibre of guests that were hosted by George at Fortuna, including royalty, governors of Victoria and Dame Nellie Melba. In a 1954 article recollection, it says each time the owner went abroad, he brought back further embellishments for his home. The main guest bathroom was marble, bath and basin, and it would compare with the most lavish modern bathroom. Fittings such as a spray shower, a plunge shower, and hairspray were all in copper. The Duke of Windsor used this bathroom when he was Prince of Wales. Beautiful mahogany cupboards lined the main bedroom. LED lights on the window depict a beautiful maiden brushing her long tresses. Music is written into the LED lights of the music room, and billiard balls in the billiard room. Some of the first sandblasted glass to be used in Australia is in the conservatory. Fortuna Villa contains several important features of rarity and significance. The Pompeii fountain, constructed in 1879 in a scale replica of the Great Fountain in Pompeii, Italy, and the gardens also included statues and a tall Roman column surmounted by a statue of a small boy. The fountain has outstanding aesthetic qualities and is believed to be unique in Australia. The conservatory features glass workmanship of the highest quality, regarded as among the most important examples of its type in Australia. It features panels of ruby-flashed seedless French antique glass, as well as frosted, acid-edged glass walls, containing a variety of artistic designs, including mining scenes, Australiana and heraldic symbols. The Roman bath, built by the Ballerstedts in the 1860s, was also an uncommon feature for large villas of the time. By the early 1900s, George Lansell had expanded the home to over 40 rooms, and it was one of the largest homes in Victoria. He transformed the industrial site of settling ponds and tailings dumps into spacious gardens and ornamental lakes, with extravagant fountains and pathways and exotic plantings. It was generally described as over the top. It was opulent and went far beyond being utilitarian. The impression was one of immense wealth and power. George Lansell enjoyed the beauty of classical Europe and the Orient, and the villa very much reflected his personal styles and tastes. George Lansell died in 1906 at the age of 82. His obituary was featured in the Sydney Morning Herald on the 19th of March 1906. Mr. George Lansell, who's been confined to his room by serious illness for some weeks past, died at his residence, Fortuna, in Bendigo today. The deceased gentleman had not been well for 2 months. His illness was accentuated by the fact that indisposition of his daughter, Miss Edith Lansell, occasioned great worry and interfered with his appetite and sleep. At 10 o'clock on Saturday night, he lost consciousness and died shortly after, 2 o'clock this afternoon. Mr. Lansell was born at Margate, Kent. One of his brothers, Wooten Lansell, who still resides in Bendigo, was a sailor, and on one of his voyages he touched at several points of Australia where gold fever was raging at its highest. The sailor wrote home of glowing accounts of which fortunes were being made at the diggings, and in 1853, with another brother, William, George set sail for the new land. After spending a few weeks at Echunga in South Australia in unprofitable diggings, he found his way to Bendigo, where he decided to take up his old trade of a soap and candle manufacturer. All his savings were invested in the leading enterprises of the day. Twice he failed, and twice he went back to work and saved more capital. Mining was then just evolving from the alluvial into the quartz stage. He obtained interests in several mines and laid the foundation for a fortune. When mines were depressed, he clung tenaciously to his shares. Ballerstedt and Son sold the 180 mine to George Lansell, only when they felt that they'd made a fortune and exhausted its resources. However, Mr. Lansell dug deeper, and the first stroke worked returned the purchaser a clear profit of £180,000, and that was a fraction of his subsequent gains. With the handsome returns he secured from his numerous private mines and investments, Mr. Lansell became exceedingly wealthy, but even then his interest in the field did not abate. When he married Miss Edith Bedsford over 20 years ago, he resided for 7 years in London, and the people of Bendigo paid him the greatest tribute his enterprise and judgment could receive when they petitioned him to return. He did return, and until his death he lived at Fortuna Villa. It is characteristic of the man that he should have ended his days on the scene of his early triumphs in which the villa is situated. It was a fitting situation for the home of Australia's Quartz King, and the home befitted of a millionaire. Mr. Lansell never took part in public life. All his energy was directed to the control of his numerous companies of which he was director and to the care of his varied private interests. To every mining man he was well known. Sharp, shrewd and determined, he was, nevertheless, well liked by all with whom he came into contact. Mr. Lansell left a widow and a family of 4 sons and 1 daughter. Victor, Horace, Leonard and Cyril, and the only daughter, Miss Edith Lansell, is at present seriously ill. The effect of Mr. Lansell's death on the mining industry in Bendigo has been a matter of some speculation. It is well known that the deceased gentleman had been a consistent supporter of a great number of paying mines, and the question of how his death will affect these mines is a matter of conjecture. If the estate were realised upon and his interest in these companies were put into the market, stated that it might mean the cessation of work in some instances. On the other hand, it is said that it is more profitable that his interest in these mines will be retained. Of late, Mr. Lansell's eldest son, Victor, has been appointed on the directorates of several companies, and it's understood he'll continue to watch the mining interests in Bendigo held by his father. And on the 20th of March 1906 in the Bendigo Advertiser, death of Mr. George Lansell, widespread sorrow. The death of Mr. George Lansell, Bendigo's Quartz King, has aroused widespread sorrow and regret for all classes of the community who recognised what an important and useful factor the deceased gentleman had been in moulding the destinies of the Bendigo goldfield. From all the public buildings yesterday, except perhaps the government offices, flags floated at half-mast, while from the extreme southerly point of the goldfield to the utmost limit of the moon group on the north, there was one long continuity of flags hoisted half-mast on the poppet heads of various claims. Nor was that the only evidence of public sorrow. The death of the pioneer was spoken of in terms of genuine sorrow everywhere. In the home and in the street it was a topic of conversation. There was universal opinion that Bendigo had indeed lost a man whose influence on the city's fortunes would be incalculably impressed for a generation or more to come. At Fortuna, the deceased gentleman's beautiful home, sympathetic messages came streaming in from far and near, and the bereaved ones were the recipients of scores of letters and telegrams from all classes throughout the state, all conveying the one assurance of deepest sympathy with the widow and family in this their hour of sore trial. From miners and mine owners up to the state governor, these messages were received, while other citizens forwarded handsome immortals. The body of the deceased gentleman, encased in a magnificent oak casket embellished with silver trimmings, rested on a temporary stand in the main hall, and a profusion of beautiful floral tokens and immortals were deposited all round. A silver plate at the head of the casket bore the words, "Our loved one," and at the bottom was another plate on which was inscribed, "At rest." And on the 6th of July 1906 in the Melbourne Argus, it outlines George Lansell's will. His total estate came in at nearly £340,000. Yesterday, the will of Mr. George Lansell of Fortuna in Bendigo was lodged for probate at the Supreme Court offices in Melbourne. His will, which was executed on the 7th of June 1899, is inscribed in a small leather-bound volume and is of considerable length. It relates to estates in Victoria valued for probate at nearly £340,000, of which £9,000 is described as realty and £330,000 as personalty. Under it, the deceased widow and the Sandhurst and Northern District Trustees, Executors and Agency Company are appointed executrix and executors and trustees. The sum of £1,000 is bequeathed to his widow to be paid immediately after the testator's death. Other bequests made are the Bendigo Gold District and General Hospital and the Bendigo Benevolent Asylum and Lying-in Hospital, £100 each, to the Vestry of All Saints Church of England, Bendigo, and to the Bishop, for the time being, of St Kilian's Roman Catholic Church, Bendigo, £500 each, to the testator's sister, Elizabeth, £5 a week for life, to his sister Annie, £5 a week for life, to his brother Wooten, mining shares to the value of £250, to his sister Susan, £250 and mining shares to the value of £750. To each of his nephews and nieces, the children of brothers Wooten and William and his sisters Susan and Annie, there are bequeathed £100 and mining shares to the value of £400. His brother Thomas is to have £250, his wife Letty £100 and mining shares to the value of £400. His wife's sister Laura £100 and mining shares to the value of £400. His niece Annie Lipscomb £250 and mining shares to the value of £750, cumulative on other legacies given to her by will, and to his niece Annie Lansell £250 and mining shares to the value of £750, cumulative on other legacies. It is directed that each of the old Bendigonians living at his death, whose group picture is in the testator's billiard room and who arrived in Bendigo in the same year of himself, 1853, or prior to that date, or within 4 years afterwards, shall receive mining shares to the value of £10. His cousins John Bailey and William Bailey receive £100 each. His cousin Charlotte Clark £250. Felicia Williams, daughter of Charles Williams, ironmonger of Bendigo, is to receive £500. Isaac E. Dyson is to get mining shares to the value of £500, and the Bendigo Stock Exchange is to have mining shares to the value of £50. Further, he bequeathed to each of the mine managers employed at the testator's private mines at the time of his death mining shares to the value of £50 to each miner employed at the same mines in the same period, with shares of a value of £5, to each labourer shares valued at £3, and to each boy shares valued at £2. Each servant employed by the testator at the time of his death is to get mining shares to the value of £10 and also £1 for each year of service. The Bendigo Stock Exchange is to settle the value of the mining shares, and all the legacies are to be subject to probate duty. After the payment of the above-mentioned legacies, the income of 1/3 of the testator's estate is to be paid to his widow for life, and after her death, £5,000 is to be paid to his eldest son, George Victor, and the remaining to be held in trust for the children of the same George Victor. The remaining 2/3 of the estate are to be left to the testator's other children in equal shares after the death of his widow or to the attaining of 25 years. The trustees authorised by the testator to sell whole or any part of real estate or personal estate at any time of their discretion, and to dispose of his mine or mines by means of lotteries, such as tadasals, in any way according to law or in any country where such lotteries are legal. There was a codicil on the will dated the 18th of October 1905. Under this codicil, the testator directed that £1,000 be paid to each of his children attaining the age of 21 years, and that £30,000 is to be paid to each child on their attaining of 25 years. The legacy to be paid to his sister Susan is altered to £5 per week, and the amount to be reduced to £100 from £500 in shares. It's also directed that on the testator's youngest child reaching the age of 25, 2/3 of the estate is to be equally divided amongst the other children. It stipulated that the testator's widow is to be the guardian of the children, and she is to have the children taught some trade or profession so they'll be able to earn their own living. In 1908, Bendigo citizens erected an over-life-sized bronze statue of George Lansell holding a lump of quartz on a granite base, and gold mining scenes and a plaque are placed on the base. The statue was unveiled by the state governor, Sir Gibson Carmichael, on the 4th of October 1908. George's second wife, Harriet Basford, and their 6 children lived at Fortuna Villa. She added improvements to the home until her death in 1933. And on the 13th of September 1934, it announces Harriet's bequest to her children. In Melbourne, personal property of an estimated value of £104,000 was left by Mrs. Edith Lansell, so she was known as Edith, her middle name, of Fortuna in Bernard Street, Bendigo, who died on the 12th of March. There was no real estate. The will was dated on the 2nd of June 1932. Mrs. Lansell left bequests of £200 to Annie Stitchman, £200 to Louis Wasbo, and £150 to Minnie Stitchman for long and faithful service. Her jewellery, according to her direction, is to be divided amongst her children. The residue of the estate is to be divided equally between her sons, George Victor Lansell and Leonard Vivian Lansell, and her daughter Edith Fortuna Victoria Norbury. The house came close to being demolished after the death of Harriet. By 1942, Fortuna Villa had been acquired by the Federal Government Department of Defence, and it was used as a map-making facility during World War II. It was a headquarters of the Survey Corps, later the Army Survey Regiment, and they based their mapping activities there until 1966, when it became Defence Imagery and Geospatial Organisation. The work of the regiment was highly important for the war effort, as preparing maps was a matter of urgency. It remained in the hands of the Defence Department until 2008. At the time of its sale, Fortuna was still operating as the Army Survey Regiment, with the mansion being used for accommodation and administration, and the former crushing works being used for the storage and printing of military maps. It's now in the hands of a private owner who permits regular tours and public access after 65 years of it being closed. The house had been stripped of its original furnishings, but still retained its magnificent lead light and etched glass windows, its pressed metal ceilings, parquetry flooring, and its very unique bathrooms and outstanding conservatory with French ruby glass imported from Italy. There was still the Pompeii fountain and a further fountain and rockery in the south garden, stables, a tailings dam converted to a brick swimming pool called the Roman Bath, a coach house, a brick laundry, a former shade house south of the home, and a garage northwest of the home for Lansell's Benz motorcar, which was the first in Bendigo. By 1889, it was estimated that collectively the Ballerstedt and Lansell had taken £1 million worth of gold from the Big 180 mine, proving it one of the richest on the new Chum line of reef. Fortuna is regarded in Bendigo today as an outstanding symbol of the town's early growth and wealth of gold, much of it attributed to Lansell's intuition for finding and exploiting reef deposits. Lansell Square was opened in 1979, known as Lansell Plaza, the shopping centre in Kangaroo Flat, a suburb of Bendigo. George Lansell's children. George Victor Lansell was born on the 3rd of October 1883 at St George Hanover Square in London. He was educated at St Andrew's College in Bendigo and the Melbourne Church of England Grammar School, and in 1906 he inherited his father's estate of £6 million. He owned the Bendigo Independent newspaper and merged it with the Bendigo Advertiser in 1918. He was a chairman of a large number of media and other companies around regional Victoria. And on the 20th of January 1910 at the All Saints Pro Cathedral in Bendigo, he married a skiing champion, Edith Florence Gwendolyn Frew, and they had 3 daughters. The article on their wedding is titled Fashionable Wedding. The wedding of Mr. George Lansell and Miss Gwendolyn Frew was the consummation of a social event, and anticipation of which had been lively and the preparation for which had been extensive. The public interest in the function was indicated by the great crowd of citizens who thronged the churchyard outside the barriers, which marked the pathway of the party and guests from the gateway to the church entrance, and assembled on the roadway and footpath adjacent to the church grounds. The guests were at nearly 400. Mr. and Mrs. Lansell received scores of telegrams from friends in all parts of the Commonwealth and a large number of cablegrams from England. On Tuesday, they will leave Melbourne by the Orvieto on an extensive tour of the old world. The wedding presents, which were displayed in the ballroom, were magnificent and stated to be valued at anything between £15,000 and £20,000. They included some magnificent silverware. Mr. Lansell marked the event by presenting each of the mining managers employed by the estate a box of cigars. Cigars were also given to the whole of the employees. Victor was first commissioned in the 8th Australian Infantry Regiment in 1904 and he was captain in 1909. In May 1916, he was a commissioned captain in Bendigo's 38th Battalion of the Australian Imperial Force. He entered the front line in France on the 1st of December and was wounded 2 days later and invalided back to Australia in the next March for discharge in the August. After the war, he rose in 1923 to Major, commanding the 38th Battalion of the Australian Military Forces, and was awarded the Volunteer Decoration and promoted to a commanding officer of his battalion. He was then raised to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in 1927 and appointed a Companion of the Order of St Michael and St George in 1937. He retired as an honorary colonel in 1942 after having organised the North West Victorian Group of the Volunteer Defence Corps early in World War II. In 1928, he won election in the Victorian Legislative Council as a nationalist member for the Bendigo province. In 1944, he defected to the Country Party, but joined the Liberal and Country Party in 1949. He was knighted in 1951 and died in Bendigo on the 9th of January 1959 at the age of 75. Edith Fortuna Victoria Lansell was born on the 27th of August 1885 at Wadsworth in Surrey, England. After her father's death, she lived mostly at Fortuna. And in March 1908, it announced in the paper that Bendigo millionaire Lansell's daughter Edith goes home at the end of this month to be presented at court. Edith married Robert Norbury in Shanghai, China on the 29th of November 1919 when she was 34 and Robert 41. They adopted a son, Peter, in 1924. The Norburys paid an extended visit to Bendigo in the late 1920s, and by then, Robert's grandmother Edith Lansell was almost bedridden, and life at the mansion was, for a solitary boy, rather dull. He spent hours playing the Angelus pianola in the billiard room and listening to Auntie Nancy's stories of Bendigo's early days. But on the whole, he wrote years later, Ettrick Lodge, his mother's property at Serpentine, was much more fun. Edith died on the 17th of November 1981 at Sedge Hill, Shaftesbury, Dorset, England, aged 96. The third child, Horace Vernon Lansell, was born on the 29th of August 1886 at Wadsworth in London. He married Emma Agnes Hosking at Serpentine Creek, Victoria in 1908, where Horace farmed. They had 4 children. Horace enlisted in World War I and upon his return was working as a sharebroker in Bendigo. He died on the 9th of December 1928 at Eaglehawk, Victoria, aged only 42. The fourth child, Leonard Vivian Lansell, was born on the 16th of October 1888 in Bendigo. He married Geraldine Orme in 1911. He lived in Bendigo and also owned the property Char Sing near Moolameen, and by 1954 owned land near Lorne in Victoria. He died on the 31st of October 1963 in Toorak, and his death was announced in the paper. Mr. Leonard Lansell, last surviving son of Mr. George Lansell, Bendigo's Quartz King, died on Thursday night. He leaves a son, Mr. George Lansell of Moolameen, New South Wales, and a daughter, Mrs. R. Graham Orr of Toorak. A sister, Mrs. Edith Norbury, lives in England. The fifth child, Eric Brooks V. Lansell, was born on the 16th of April 1891 in Bendigo and died on the 13th of June 1901 at Fortuna Villa. It says much sympathy was expressed in Bendigo with the announcement of the death of Master Eric Lansell. The deceased lad was only 11 and had been in ill health for some time, the cause of death eventually being diagnosed as diabetes. The sixth child, Cyril Vane Lansell, was born on the 17th of April 1893 in Bendigo. He married Lila Charlton Anthony on the 16th of March 1915 and they had a son, Eric Vane Lansell, on the 21st of May 1916 and 3 other children. Cyril served in World War I. On the 28th of April 1915 in the Sydney Sun, it says Australians for the front. Mr. Cyril Lansell of Bendigo has been appointed to the Royal Flying Corps. On the 2nd of August 1915 in the Bendigo Advertiser, it announces that Mr. Cyril Lansell, who's in London, has placed his motor car and his services at the disposal of the Red Cross Society. He has kept busy conveying wounded soldiers to different hospitals and acts as chauffeur to the medical staff whose duties require their attendance at many places where the wounded are receiving attention. And on the 7th of August 1918, a cablegram's been received from driver Cyril Lansell from Suva. He's expected to land in Sydney today and will reach Bendigo next week. And on the 5th of September 1918 in the Bendigonian, it announces that Cyril Lansell returns. He's been in the Army Medical Transport Service abroad and has returned on furlough. Mr Lansell went to England and offered his services and was attached to the Transport Service. During his long service in that capacity, he's witnessed much of the activities in this important branch of transport. Cyril was a sheep farmer at Sebastian and also lived in St Kilda. In 1929, he was a garage proprietor in Malvern, Victoria, and also travelled widely as an investor. In 1929, at the age of 36, he admitted himself into the Lara inebriate retreat near Geelong, Victoria, for 6 months. He then owned and ran Kananaji near Corowa. Cyril died on the 30th of March 1932 in Corowa, aged only 38. And his death notice reads, "Death of member of leading Bendigo family. The death occurred at Corowa yesterday of Mr Cyril Lansell, the youngest son of the late Mr George Lansell. He was the brother of Colonel Lansell MLC. At the outbreak of the war, he was on his honeymoon in England. He enlisted with the British Army and served throughout the war. And George Lansell's siblings who came to Australia. Wooten Lansell was born at Margate, Kent, England on the 1st of March 1825, and his death notice accounts for much of what he achieved in his life. Mr Wooten Lansell, brother of Mr George Lansell, an old pioneer who took more than an active interest in the development of the Bendigo goldfields, died at his residence in Breen Street, Quarry Hill, of influenza, aged 82. Until about 6 weeks ago, the deceased gentleman enjoyed the best of health, and news of his demise will come as a painful shock to Bendigonians. By his death, Bendigo has lost a pioneer who materially assisted in the progress of the mining industry. As a youth, Mr Lansell went to sea, and after considerable coastal shipping experience in Great Britain, he attached himself to the Pestangee Bombangee, which brought soldiers of the 11th Regiment to their quarters in Sydney in the early 1840s. He returned to England and subsequently shipped on the Lord Peter as third mate. The Lord Peter was employed in the Vandemonian transportation trade and carried 300 convicts to the Tasmanian settlement. He made a second voyage in this trade on the Castle Eden with 350 convicts on board. He was also engaged in the Eastern trade, visiting China, Japan and Ceylon, and he held a mariner's registered certificate. Finally, in 1850, Mr Lansell sailed from England on the Lapwing for Australia. He was chief officer on the vessel. Adelaide was reached in the same year, and there the officers and crew left the vessel, which was afterwards wrecked. Mr Lansell became a mounted trooper in Adelaide and remained there until he contracted the gold fever. Persistent stories have reached him of the great amount of gold being found in Victoria. In the company of G. Graham and W. Paramore, the deceased came to Victoria at the beginning of 1852. They commenced digging around Long Gully and Growler's Gully, and after prospecting there for a while, went to try their fortunes on the Ovens district. A little while later, Mr Lansell returned to Melbourne and went back to Adelaide. He married Ellen Hall in Adelaide on the 27th of September 1854 when he was 29 and Ellen 20. They had 6 children. He remained in his earlier Australian home for 3 months and then came back to Bendigo. Here he again joined his companions and commenced searching again for gold with fair success. After a time, Mr Lansell entered the carpentering trade. Not content with working for a master, however, he decided to commence business for himself and chose butchering as the most profitable. He occupied a store in View Street. His successes in Victoria induced his 2 brothers, George and William Lansell, to emigrate. The 3 brothers commenced a candle factory, but it was not long before Wooten retired from the business to take on farming pursuits at Leichhardt. For 30 years he remained on the land, which he worked profitably. Then he retired and went to live at Quarry Hill and continued his attentions to mining. He became associated with many companies and at the time of his death was directly connected with more than 37 companies. In addition, he held shares in many other mines. His son, Mr Thomas Lansell, is on the farm at Leichhardt. One of his daughters, Mrs Lithgow, lives in Queensland. Another, Mrs Randall, wife of Mr A.H. Randall of Quarry Hill, and the third wife of Mr T. Hall, the well-known Bendigo cricketer. His other brother, William Lansell, was born in 1828 in Margate, Kent, England. He emigrated to Victoria by 1859, where he married Jane Croucher Anderson when he was 31 and Jane 24. They had 5 children, with 4 surviving infancy. He was a miner and he died on the 12th of October 1886 at Bendigo, aged 58. And his obituary in the Bendigo Advertiser says, Mr William Lansell died at his residence, Back Creek, yesterday morning after an illness of 8 months' duration. He was the brother of Mr George Lansell, the well-known wealthy mine owner, and he was born in Margate, Kent 52 years ago. He's been a resident of Bendigo for 33 years, but has never identified himself with any public movements. At one time he carried on a soap factory, which was formerly his brother's, before fortune smiled on that gentleman. He subsequently relinquished this business and followed the occupation of a miner. In February of the present year, miner's consumption in a bad form attacked him, and he lingered until yesterday morning, expiring at 7:30. He leaves a grown-up family to mourn his death. The third sibling that came to Australia was Susan Lansell. She was born in 1829 in Margate, Kent, England. In 1851, Susan was a school mistress in Kent. She married George Budds and they had 7 children. They emigrated to Australia on the Golden South in June 1853, and she died on the 22nd of April 1922 in Bendigo. And her death notice in the Melbourne Argus says, Mrs. Susan Budds, who died on Sunday, aged 93, was one of the oldest residents of Bendigo. She was the sister of the late Mr. George Lansell and has lived in Bendigo for more than 60 years. She was a leading worker of St Paul's Church and was for many years the secretary of the Ladies' Benevolent Society. And Anne Lansell, who was born in 1831 in Margate, Kent, England, emigrated by 1867 when she married John Northcote. They lived in Bendigo and had a daughter, Edith Annie Northcote. She died on the 22nd of September 1904 in Bendigo, aged 73, and her obituary in the Bendigo Advertiser says numerous friends of Mrs. Annie Northcote, wife of James Northcote, the well-known ex-bandmaster, will regret to hear of her demise, which occurred yesterday evening at her residence, Tivoli, in Lilly Street. The cause of death was general debility. Mrs. Northcote was the youngest sister of George and Wooten Lansell. She came to Victoria in company with her sister, Mrs. George Budds of Back Creek. In 1866, she married James Northcote, and after residing for 2 years at Leichhardt, they came to Bendigo and took up their home in Lilly Street. Much sympathy will be felt for Mr. Northcote, who himself has been ill for the last 3 years of chronic bronchitis. There is one daughter, Mrs. A.J. Williams. And James Northcote's death was announced on the 19th of December 1904, so only 2 months after his wife. When he left Leichhardt, Mr. Northcote became Mr. Lansell's general manager and continued in that capacity for 26 years. He was manager of the 180 mine, and it's estimated that the gold to the value of £1 million sterling was taken from that mine. It is perhaps in the capacity of a bandsman that Mr. Northcote was best known, as he became a familiar figure not only in the chief centres of Victoria but throughout Australia. He first became leader of the Old Volunteer Band and subsequently leader of the battalion band Castlemaine. It was when he became leader of the musical combination known as Northcote's Brass Band that the fame of the band became widespread, as some 25 years ago it was one of the finest bands in Australia and held that distinction for many years. Mr. Northcote was a cornet player of high ability, and in 1871 he was presented by the citizens of Bendigo with a handsome silver cornet in recognition of his services as a musician. During his career in Bendigo, he invested in mining in a good deal, but was not very fortunate in this respect, and he lost a good deal of money on the new Chum line. Naturally, he was well known and warmly respected, especially by bandsmen who have, however, not seen him about for some time owing to ill health. He was a genial citizen and made a large circle of sincere friends. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the magnificent Fortuna Villa. And next time you're in Bendigo, you may want to go and have a look.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.